So welcome everybody. This is the first staff faculty forum after spring break, right? So welcome back everybody. Hope everybody had a good, productive, relaxing spring break, whatever the case might be. So I will of course formally introduce the speaker in a bit, but I also want to remind folks about we have two groups, if you will, of attendees here. We of course have all of you here sitting in the room with us. We also have probably a few folks who are joining us remotely. So I want to remind everybody we will have time for questions after the presentation. So of course for folks who are here, you can ask your question, and of course our speaker will address the questions. But those folks who are joining us remotely, you also have the opportunity to ask questions. Please send your questions to ORSP email, and that is orsp@uwec.edu. We will be monitoring that email address, and we will relay those questions to our speaker. So please, join us in interacting with the entire group of folks who are in the forum. Well, without further ado, let me formally welcome and introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker today, of course, is Dr. Lanita Davis from the Management and Marketing Department, and she is the director of the Center of Sales and Sales Management on campus. Prior to this appointment, Dr. Davis was the executive director of the University of Arkansas Little Rock Professional Sales Program. She's also the founding director of the University of Alabama's Sales Program. She is the president-elect of the University Sales Center Alliance. She publishes frequently in an array of leading journals, including Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management, Journal of Business Research, Journal of Retailing, Journal of Consumer Affairs, and Journal of Business and Industrial Marketing. Dr. Davis has also co-authored a sales management textbook titled Sales Management, Shaping Future Sales Leaders. So thank you for joining us here today, and the forum is all yours.
Okay, well thank you, and I don't know, it might be weird to be talking about mass incarceration right after spring break, and I would expect that many of you thought I'd be talking about sales, given that most of my research and my background is sales, but I picked something that I was very passionate about. I started doing this project because of my own personal experience. We all have 20-year-olds. One of them ended up in jail. And in the process of getting her out of jail, there were $25 and $50 phone calls that I was happy to pay for. There was a $7,000 lawyer bill. I mean, I was just rolling out the money to be in touch with my child and to finally get her out. And everything turned out well. But I started then to think about, well, I had $7,000. I had $50 to take a phone call from my child. What do other people, what happens to other people? And I started to look, and that half of all prisoners who are incarcerated, their families end up in bankruptcy. And then I started to look at the money. I said, I'm a marketer, and it's sales, but marketer primarily. I was like, this is a huge marketplace, something that has not been studied, something that has not been looked at. So I began that journey, and my co-authors who aren't here, Casey Carter Rockwell and David Crockett, were the two that wrote this article with me. And Casey had a background in law enforcement, David has a background in consumer behavior, and I brought the marketing perspective in. So let's talk about this. How bad is mass incarceration in the US? Well, if you look here, we have over 2 million people incarcerated, right? And we look at state, jail, federal. A lot of them are for drug offenses, nonviolent, but we incarcerate a lot of people, okay? And to put this in further perspective for you, let's look at how many we incarcerate versus other countries. Okay, now I'm going to talk a lot about Arkansas. This was a case study done with Arkansas, and you can kind of see why. This is their incarceration rate per 100,000 people. It beats the national average. Then you look at the US versus UK, Portugal. The people who are close to us are El Salvador, Turkmenistan, Cuba. right? And we're still higher than those countries. We're higher than people who have similar criminal rates. We put a lot of people in jail. And so these carceral facilities cost on average $80.7 billion a year to keep them in operation. So we jail a lot of people, and we have a lot of facilities to put them in. Now, a lot of, when I present this, they're like, well, they're prisoners, they committed a crime. But what we forget is a lot of people in jail have not even been convicted of a crime, and yet they're still a part of the prison marketplace. Now, the other thing that makes this important is we hear a lot of incidental evidence, anecdotal evidence about things that happen in prison. But we're going to take a meso-level approach in looking at this. So we're going to look at it as an institution, because in that, there's applications to other government-run institutions. Who among us doesn't wonder where our tag fees, our driver's license fees go to? Or you go to a hospital, why is a tissue $1? A public hospital, right? We have no idea. They're run by the government, so they can set the price, and there's no competition. So we're going to take a meso-level approach. I'm going to give you a little background on the emergence of mass incarceration and this idea of the prison industrial complex. It's not just prison now, it's a prison industrial complex. And then we're going to look at more detail the financial harm caused by incarceration. And so I gave you this example. If you look at this, 15-minute phone call goes from $1.80 to $24.82, $24.82. Can you imagine? Just for a 15-minute phone call. That doesn't count the setup charges to be set up in the prison phone call system if your call gets disconnected or dropped, because you buy it in 15-minute increments. Okay? So think about how that adds up. So here's my research question. So how does a carceral state, through its agencies, enable rent-seeking practices? And I'm going to talk about what we mean by rent-seeking practices that inflict financial harm on incarcerated consumers and their supporters, because it goes beyond just the person who's incarcerated. It also affects their family. If you have a son or daughter in jail or in prison, are you going to turn down that collect phone call? Probably not. Are you going to, you're going to spend money supporting that person. Another interesting impact we don't often think about is half of the people who are in prison or in jail before they were imprisoned were the primary source of financial support for their family. So that's gone, right? And like in my daughter's case, the DA wanted to prove or teach her a lesson. So she was taken to jail like in August, and they weren't going to schedule her arraignment until December. So they were going to hold her there for all that time, which is why Mom paid $7,000 and called a few friends and worked it out. But if I didn't have that, she would have been there in December. What does that mean? Job is gone. Apartment is gone. All those things gone. And even though they were dismissed and she was innocent, it wouldn't have mattered. You've got to rebuild again, okay? But let's keep going on to the marketplace. Now, how did we get here? Well, look, here's where we were back in the day, right? And then we hit late 70s, early 80s. A lot of people blame this on Nixon, but a lot of this started with the war on drugs and the drug policy and mandatory sentencing. As a matter of fact, it's to be said that with the change in the drug policy, I think our incarceration rate went up 171%. It's like a ridiculous amount. You could see that on this chart. The other thing was this market-dominant logic. We don't talk about it often. We say, well, it's drug policy, but we also moved to this model where public institutions could rely on public support. Like we know from higher ed, right? Everybody's laughing, right? You better go raise some money. You better go get a donor or something, because imagine if we only relied on the money we got from the state to even run our own institution, where we would be at. And so we became this market dominant logic within our institutions to rely on public support. Okay, and in doing that, we brought in a lot of outside vendors and developed this thing called the prison industrial complex, which we define as like a matrix of private, public institutions that all work together to keep people in prison. Well, I don't say that, but to handle our incarcerated population. And so that's why we call it the prison industrial complex. But this whole market mentality, as this went up, we said, well, how are we going to pay? How are we going to support all this? And so then they came into, well, where is the money? And so that's where we go into rent seeking. And we use that kind of as a frame to look at this and the ethics of this. Now, in the past, the traditional definition of rent seeking is economic rent or return on a resource in excess of the owner's opportunity cost or next best use. Okay? And it tended to be viewed as something unethical. So think of gas gouging, right? They would call that rent-seeking behavior. Carceral institutions especially are vulnerable to this because think about it, they make the rules and they don't have competitors. They exempt themselves from certain laws that other institutions have to go by, like they don't have to publish their prices. They don't have to fully report their financial holdings, right? So most companies have to publish a year-end corporate statement. DOC, we'll find later, just kind of gives you a summary, right? You don't get to dig through the details. And they make the laws, right? So, but the problem with this and using this in research is it's already kind of biased, right? You think of it as, okay, anything that's a rent is negative. And it doesn't include, legitimate, it kind of lumps in there legitimate profit-making opportunity. So Jaworski came out with this redefinition in that those who determine distribution or allocation of the rents or the monies, and they're political agents or political actors. So he deliberately focused it on political activities, government activities, which gave us entree into looking at carceral institutions and the ethics behind their rent charging, okay? So let's go on to the next. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about what's the financial harm done by rent seeking. And so think about it. In prison, a lot of the daily operations are outsourced to vendors. So the cafeteria, some run the entire prison, right? The security, communications, who knows a good portion of the daily operations are outsourced. But these vendors, a lot of times get these contracts on no bids. And we even did research to look at, like, if I want to be a vendor to a prison, what do I need to go through? Good luck trying to find it. Good luck. And there are 2 to 5 major players almost in any parts of the prison industry. JPay is one, and now the other one slips my mind, but it's 2 or 3 that are major players. So even to get a contract, you got to know someone. It's no bid and it's very close. And a lot of these services are marketed directly to the family of prisoners or to the prisoners themselves. So for example, if you want to send a prisoner a gift, there are certain vendors specified by the prison or the jail that you have to use to send them a gift. You can't just go to Amazon and mail them something. You have to go through one of the pre-approved prison vendors. If you want to send them an email, the same thing. If you want to do FaceTime with them, same thing. It has to go through their vendors, which means you pay their price. And what you often leave out is that the prisons get a commission on everything you buy from these vendors. And because they don't have to report it, you don't know how much they're pocketing from those commissions. And so where we see the most is like digital media. So for example, video phone calls, video face-to-face, video meetings, right? Where you can visit the biggest one, and sometimes you do the bait and switches, tablets for prisoners, right? So they now use tablets, and they've seen giving prisoners tablets reduces suicide, causes them to pursue an educational opportunity. And so, just like a lot of digital media, some of it's free, some of it's paid. So, for example, if you want to watch a movie, it's 3 to 5 cents per minute on the tablet. If you want to download a song, it's $2 per song. If you want to, and some places even rent the tablet to you, and they rent it by the hour, right? So they reel you in, right? There's more money. And so there's more digital media that they're using to collect rents. Phone calls we talked about, copay on medical expenses. Well, let's think about it. The copay, on average, goes between, let's say, $15 and $25. I think it's $25. But anyway, it doesn't sound like a lot, right? But prisoners on average make between $0 to $1.19 an hour. Okay, so it's about a month's wages just to get the copay, right? Now, you could say, well, their family could send it to them, right? The way you send money to a prisoner is through their banking system, right? So there is a minimum of a $10 balance that you have to keep at all times, and it's a 5% charge on each transaction. So every time you use it, they're taking another 5% out, right? So and who knows where those fees are going, right? And then commissaries, and we'll talk about Arkansas and the prices they charge in their commissaries. But, you're only issued so much underwear when you first get in. I like to use underwear because everybody deems that a necessity, right? So it's more than just buying chips and Coke, right? But you're only given so much deodorant, toothpaste, and underwear when you first arrive in prison. At some point, you got to buy more. And so I've seen underwear go from $7 to $15 a pair, depending on the state. Some charge a normal rate, but it adds up. On average, I think prisoners spend about $950 a year in the commissary, but they're only making 3, 5, 10 cents an hour. Okay. So that's financial harm. So we looked at Arkansas, right? One, I lived in Arkansas at the time. But two, Dr. Rockwell is a former, we have to disclose this when we do cases, but she was a former law enforcement agency. She had friends in the prison system. So a lot of the information we got, we can't tell you where we got it from because we interviewed some respondents and we were told under secrecy. But some of this I can tell you. So again, Arkansas, highest incarceration rate. And when you see the money they make off prisoners, maybe the two go together, I don't know. They also have a disproportionate number of underrepresented groups, minorities, blacks, Hispanics, in prison. Look at this incarceration rate. 593 per 100,000, 2,412 for African Americans per 100,000 in the state of Arkansas. Little scary. Hispanics, 915. That's nothing to sneeze at either. But that causes disproportionate harm to the state as we look at EDI, efforts like EDI, because once you have a record, that makes you ineligible for other jobs, right? That hurts you in terms of education. That hurts you in terms of your finances. And then there's we'll talk about the revenue that they generate from sales and incarcerated members. All right, now I can't click. All right, so let's look at Arkansas and the harm that they cause. So in Arkansas, for all the government agencies, there's a cap on how much you can charge when you resell, except for jails, prisons, carceral institutions, and universities. Everybody else has to have a cap, but but these guys get an exception. And that's what I mean by they write the rules, they write the laws, and a lot of these marketplaces are exempt from the law. So you can imagine what our general marketplace would be like if, well, I don't know, if, let's say, the food industry didn't have any laws, right? They could just do whatever they want. There's no checking on what they do or what they put in the food or how much it weighs. Where would our society be? Okay? And so review of their pricing reveals things are marked up beyond the normal market by about 50%. Okay? And again, I told you about the banking balance, right? $10 minimum and 5% on every transaction. So every time they buy something and they use their bank account, there's another 5% added on top of that. And they already pay tax. So there's the price, there's tax, there's 5%. Okay? And they sell products. Now, the contrast on that is in Arkansas, prisoners do not get paid a wage. The philosophy is, when I interviewed some of the officials, is that their work pays for their room and board while they're in jail or prison. Okay? So they work for free to make products that the prison resells. Right? So furniture, at one time they did underwear for Victoria's Secret, you know, that big scandal. And you can get a whole catalog of their products and services to buy. Right? But you can't get pricing for what they charge in the commissary. Believe me, I tried. Federal prisons are required to do this, but local jails, not required. The other thing is, in the rules or in the guide that they give to prisoners and families, you're supposed to, the money that comes, the profit that comes from the commissary is supposed to go to the inmate welfare fund. But they do the reporting and the accounting of what money got collected and what the profit was for that fund. And the disclosure is very minimal, it's very hidden. Okay? So that is some of the financial harm that is occurring to the incarcerated in Arkansas. And so if you look at this is an example of them being transparent on their spreadsheet. Look at it. General revenue, is that $364 million? Quite a bit of money. Improvement transfers, but they don't tell you what they are. They get revenue from farms, industry produced goods. I think that's $7 million. And here is the inmate phone and other revenue, but they don't specify what the other is. And that's $2 million. And then there's a state tax they collected, but other rent. I mean, they don't really specify all the liabilities. This is all the reporting that they have to do in terms of the monies they receive on 360, what they do with that money and where it came from. That's it. And so that's a problem, right? Where is that money going? And they're not required to report it. So we're going to look at ways to address the harm. I mean, you know, we can go on and on about how, you know, what the harm is, but let's talk about addressing it. One is communication transparency through standard reporting. Corporations are required to report based on a standard. They can't just have a line and then a number. They have to show you where that stuff comes from. So that's one thing. And putting that out for public scrutiny, you know, that's another thing, right? You're required to publish your corporate report. Prisons should as well. The other is governance. Now, in one state, Mississippi, believe it or not, they had no governance, and they found out, there's some not so ethical activity going on. And so what they did is they moved the funds to the state treasurer's office, and I think in order to get any kind of, they moved it to the state treasurer's office for oversight and for reporting. The problem with that is you're kind of moving the ball to another department, right? Because they didn't do anything about what they charge prisoners, right? The prices, the vendors, the private industry. They didn't do anything about that. So you just moved the ball to the treasurer's office versus the prison's office. It might help some, but still an issue. So the third thing we talked about is having strict revenue caps. And so in Delaware, they have a strict revenue cap on what prisons can charge. It's like a 20% surcharge limit. They audit the commissary every 3 years. The funds are maintained by a banking organization set up by the Treasury. And again, expenditures over $2,000 must be approved by the bureau chief. And so when you look at that, their phone costs are lower. It's a totally different situation in Delaware. Now, Others have recommended other approaches like decarceration, and it's not like defunding the police, so I don't want to start a riot on the internet, but we look at, the traffic incident my daughter's involved in. Did that really require jail time? No one got hurt. It was a fender bender, but she spent a week in jail. There's a bunch of nonviolent offenses. There's our issue of bail that the decarceration people are looking at. We find that people who make less than $20,000 a year are the ones who are in jail because they can't make bail. Not surprising. People make 30 or 40, they're out, right? And so while they're in jail, there's all these financial harm that's going on. So decarceration might minimize the problem, but it doesn't eliminate it, right? And so we see this idea of transparency in governance and these caps as a way of addressing the financial harm inflicted by carceral institutions. Now, this model or these recommendations aren't just limited to carceral institutions, it's limited to any institution operated by the government that seeks rent. So like I mentioned before, motor vehicle department. I don't know a lot about that, but when I go pay my tag money, I do feel like some rent is being collected, right? In the hospital, a public or a government-run hospital, I do feel like rent is being collected. And so we're encouraging researchers and activists to kind of look at this model or look at what we're proposing and see how it applies to other government institutions and other areas where rent-seeking behavior is prominent. So another area we're looking at here in the future as we go on this is, Casey and Dave have a thing about, well, I do too, because I've been a tenant, landlords. And in some state, landlord laws are great, but in Arkansas and other states I've lived in and rented apartments from, the laws definitely favor the landlords. So, for example, landlords do not even have to keep their place habitable for their tenants, and they can still charge you rent. And not paying rent is a felony in the state of Arkansas and some other states as well. So that concludes. I don't know, I probably went shorter than what I was supposed to, but any questions? Yes?
I'm wondering if you know whether this kind of financial rent-seeking plays into or pays into the prison gerrymandering, if there's any relationship or...
Mm-hmm. Can you say more when you talk about gerrymandering?
Well, in certain states, in Wisconsin, I believe there are certain districts that are carved out that are specifically around prisons.
Right.
And those people tend to have more votes for specific delegates, I guess.
Right.
So I was wondering if perhaps there's any relationship.
Probably. I mean, there's a strong connection between politicians and prisons. The prison system has a huge, private prisons, huge lobby, huge political lobby. I tried to sneak into one of their conferences, to get some more detail, but they kind of pre-screen you before you go for obvious reasons. But yeah, there's a huge lobby for the prisoners. So yeah, probably. I can't say 100% because I'm on camera, but probably. Other questions? Yes?
I remember from reading this paper and something else you published that in the state of Wisconsin, Milwaukee has the highest percentage of African American prisoners. I think actually it's either in the nation or the world.
Ooh. I think nation, not sure world. Not sure world. Yes, Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. It's pretty high. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to pull up Wisconsin's incarceration rate, but
know that your
It's pretty high.
research was done in Arkansas, but did you have an opportunity at all to look at any of the carceral institutions in Wisconsin?
I looked at the carceral rate in terms of how many people are incarcerated, and you're right at the national average, maybe a scooch, a little bit more, but you're over 600 per 100,000 people incarcerated. I didn't get a chance to look at Wisconsin laws. We did reference Wisconsin a couple of times in the paper, but I can't remember distinctly specific laws. But let me go back to what you're charging for phone rates. That might give me some indication. Let's see here. This is a comparison of what DC publishes when I talk about transparency versus Arkansas. Do you see how it's detailed, and they tell you what they get from juvenile programs, recreation, that kind of thing. But I think, let me go. Let's see here. Here you go, Wisconsin. Ooh, $21. So yes, see that? $21.97 for 15 minutes of phone conversation in the state of Wisconsin. Ooh, but you're not as bad as Arkansas. Other questions? Yes.
Question, when you said that in Arkansas they can basically justify that they don't pay for labor because it's for room and board.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense as far as like, if you have to pay for labor, otherwise, is it optional? Like, is it mandatory? Because otherwise that's like, basically like non-paid labor.
Yeah.
Like equivalent of like.
It's mandatory. You don't have an option. And so, like, I can't show expression when I'm interviewing the prison officials, right? But I even asked about people who get on work release, and they let them keep some of the money on work release, but then they send them a bill for lodging. And when you get out of prison, there's a bill to cover your expenses that you have to pay back. And if you don't pay back, it's considered a violation of probation and you're back in jail. So you have to get a job quick, fast, in a hurry so you can pay back the prison for keeping you in prison, and on and on it goes. There's other issues like that we didn't think about, couldn't cover. But for example, when you go to prison, let's say you were in low-income housing before you went into prison, you're poor. You're no longer allowed to stay in the low-income housing anymore. And if you stay with your family who are in low-income housing, they will get evicted and lose their Section 8 benefits. So it's really hard, right, to stay out. I mean, there's some other things they do, preventative measures, but they do charge you, in Arkansas, they charge you for room and board for being in prison. I know, shocking. Yes.
You mentioned, in general, corporations have to disclose more things to the public as a public corp.
Right.
The companies that are, some of them running some of the prisons in the nation, do they disclose like a normal company, or do they get some of the benefits of this secrecy that applies to the other kinds of state or federal institutions?
They get some of the benefits. So what they do is they're allowed to do some aggregate. So they'll say commissions paid out, and they'll do it in the aggregate, but they don't have to report exactly what prisons it went to and how much, right? And yeah. So they do get some shielding. Yes?
Kind of on the same note between the public and the private institutions, did you notice any differences between those on financial harms, or maybe the way they contracted out, or any differences between private and public institutions?
No, not really, because the services, all the services that cause financial harm, let's say the phone, all of that's contracted out. None of that's within the prison system, right? Food, the commissary, all that food and stuff, contracted out, right? So, yeah. And then if a private, then again, to dig into the other financials of private versus public, it's protected under the law. So you can't seriously dig in. But I do know that every service automatically, except for the officers that work there, but even some of that gets contracted out, right? So for example, I mentioned the inmate welfare fund. Some of the interesting things I found there is they charge you for maintenance and oversight of the commissary in the inmate welfare fund, right? But they don't tell you like how many guards, how many hours. It's some astronomical number, but it's going to the guards. So they say. Other questions?
Do you see very many initiatives to make for there to be more transparency in this industry?
Well, that's where the lobbying part comes in. So activists, campaign strenuously, but the prison lobbyists give money, right? And then that's where you get the law and order, right? They'll focus on people who are made guilty, who were guilty, and we do have people who are guilty or violent, but think about it. You rarely hear them mention people who are in jail waiting trial and can't make bail. Very little conversation about that. It's always, well, got to keep criminals, we do the law and order thing, right? Got to keep criminals off the street. Have to, illegal aliens, we got to put them, get them off the street. But we don't think about, hey, you pick me up, I'm innocent, but I don't have money to pay bail. I have to wait till I'm arraigned, and then I get a public defender, but meanwhile, I'm paying all this money. So that's how they so that's why I started doing this. I was surprised at how many people have had interactions with the prisons and jail system, one. And two, just build our awareness, right? And see the entirety of the picture. Yes?
Are there relationships between these rents and
Shoot.
things like
I thought I got rid of these. Sorry, I'm sorry, I was
Are
busy.
there any links that you know between these rents and recidivism rates?
Ooh, I didn't look at that. That's a good one. I know it's very high in, was it 60? It was pretty high in Arkansas, but we didn't look at that totally.
Sounds like it's the punishment that keeps on punishing. Right?
It is, and then that's where the transparency comes in. It's very difficult to get the prisons to tell you what the recidivism rate is. Because they get money for re-education, education programs, and they don't really want it out that might not be as high as what it is. But that would be a good thing to look at. I'll see if that's possible.
And it also occurs to me that although we've got the figures there, those figures may not actually result in income, because if the person has eventually has zero assets, it's really just a debt.
Well, no, you can't call unless you give them a credit card.
Right, yeah.
You get paid up front.
But you end up with a debt, right?
Well, your family does. Is that what you're talking about?
It could be the family, if they've got a family, right?
Right.
But it seems to me like the side of this that says this all generates an income stream, and it's a full income stream, might not be as good as they think it's going to be for them. So if Wisconsin's charging you $22 for 15 minutes, but you've got a lot of people who they're in debt, you're not getting $22 back really. They're going to reach their credit limit, or there's going to be some limit, right, where that person ends up at rock bottom.
Yeah, I haven't looked at who's rock bottom, a lot of prisoners do lose touch with family, things of that nature, but I don't know. It's a pretty healthy, but it's a pretty healthy stream currently that they're getting in the jail system. So and you got to think, this is jail. People are awaiting trial. So prison would be another story. But jail, typically you're going to get out, or most of them are going to get out before, if you're awaiting trial or whatever, you're going to get out before you hit zero. And families are very resourceful, right? So your family on the outside, some point they'll get another job or pay the debt off and want to still keep in touch with you, hopefully. But we don't know what the income stream is because they don't report it. They don't have to report it, which is part of our point. Yes.
So, really interesting, and I know your research is in Arkansas, but I'm just wondering, like, the chairs we're sitting in, the tables we're at are, Rapid State Industries, which is somehow vaguely, we don't really understand it, connected to the prison industrial complex.
Correct.
Do you know anything about that? And it's hard to find that information. Do you know anything about that relationship, that company, that?
I know that, when I look at the wages of prisoners and what they get paid, the highest I saw was $1.40 an hour. So let's say, no, $1.15, sorry. But let's say they're at the high end of the range in getting $1.15 an hour. What do they sell these, what do they sell the tables for, right? And so Badger's making the money, and then the prison charges Badger for manufacturing the table, but we don't know what the split is, right? And then I don't know how much the tables cost.
Well, on that note, I'm sure you've seen Badger State Industries furniture bills. There's like, the price is always double what the invoice is for. Almost always. I've never understood why, but maybe it's got something to do with.
Because you get a discount.
Why do we get the discount? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it because we have to buy from them that we get a discount?
I know in certain lines you don't have a choice, right? You are bound.
We are.
Right.
You're bound to buy from Badger State.
Unless we get an exemption, which has to come from Badger State.
Right. And, I don't know what their costs are, just to be fair, on security and things of that nature. But we don't know because they don't tell us, right? And so that's why we're pushing transparency. Maybe we wouldn't be as skeptical if they were more transparent about how much the prison gets, and prisoners got it, they could explain to us why they make $1 an hour to make a table that costs way more than that, right? We couldn't get away with paying people $1 an hour. Anything else? Yes.
Well, similarly, you said that these are no bid contracts, like that there's no way to know anything about that. But usually government have to have a bid process. So it does seem like, why is this separate? Is it just prisons and universities? That's the only?
Prisons.
Oh, okay.
Prisons. So they changed the laws. I mean, to exempt prisons. And they'll say it's for security reasons. So, or they won't say anything at all. They'll exempt prisons, period.
Well, looking at time.
Okay.
This is a great discussion. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you.